Welcome to massive open online course on public financial administration. I welcome you to today's lecture on new economic policy. New economic policy, basically we have to understand what is economic policy. Normally economic policy that deals with the demand and supply factors in a nation. Economic policy tries to keep balance between demand and supply in a nation. Since the status of the economy depends upon not only of the factors within the nation, it is also depend upon external factors. It is seriously and constantly in variance depending upon the changes in the world economy. The economic policy not only respond to the domestic situation but also the international situations. Why we need an economic policy? An economic policy is needed for a nation for directing the economic forces within the nation but also the international forces to understand the nature of the nation's economy. Economies of the world normally classified in terms of ideological basis of the economy such as liberal, socialist, market, etc., etc. The ideological positions always vary or changes over a period of time. However, the question of individual role in the economy is main focus of an economic policy. Individuals may own property without any limits, where the liberal or a market economy based economy always try to emphasize. And individuals may not be allowed to own property beyond a certain limit or no minimum limit also, and this is called where that socialist economy insists. In sum, economic policy is formulated by the government and implemented by the government, and if needed, changes in the direction of the economic policy also depending upon social, political and economic situation prevailing at that point of time. And if you take the case of the Indian economy, India was a colony of the British Empire for over 200 years. During the British rule, India underwent a drastic change from its traditional economic pattern to modern economic system. India attained its independence in 1947 and started its economic development effort since 1950 with the formation of Planning Commission. India adopted a planned economy with a centralized planning with the strategy of rapid industrialization by implementing centrally prepared 5-year plans. The 5-year plans involved a massive investments basically funded from external borrowings. Major investments were made on state-owned enterprises in producing basic and heavy industrial goods such as steel, chemicals, machines and tools, locomotives and power. And the leaders believed that the industrial sector offers the greatest scope of growth in production. Investments in state public sector enterprises were made basically based on the ideology to establish a socialist pattern of society. This system put the activities of the private sector under check, which eventually led to license Raj or permit Raj, where for starting an enterprise by a private persons, many constraints were posed to discourage the private sector participation. On the contrary, the agriculture sector also faced crisis in 1947, when due to Indo-Pak war situation and also other international situation, there was a food crisis in India. To address the food crisis, the government introduced intensive agriculture district program in 8 districts of the nation, India. However, success of IADP program led the government to extend the program to all the states in India, and India was able to attain self-sufficiency in food grain production by this late 1960s. So what exactly happened in Indian economy? What happened to the Indian economy after 1960s when we come out of the food crisis and other immediate crisis? So under the fixed exchange rate regime, that is keeping the value of the rupee against the popular currency at a constant level that existed in the country, high inflation in the 1960s reduced country's exports while increasing its imports, resulting in the shortage of foreign exchange. The industrial licensing system designed to ensure that the private sector operated according to the 5-year plans became the source of inefficiency and corruption. So by 1980s, a substantial number of influential people has come to the conclusion that the government did not have the political and administrative capacity to successfully run a controlled economy that delivered on economic growth. When a foreign exchange shortage threatened a crisis in 1991, the government made a clear break with the past policies. The other factors which led to the change of strategy in 1991, the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit during 1990-91 was around 8.4% of the GDP. And the Gulf War crisis in 1991, the situation was aggravated by the rise in price of oil due to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Rise in prices, inflation rate increased from 6.7% to 16.7% due to the rapid increase in money supply, and the country's economic position became worse. So, 1991 economic reforms started by this in this context. So, in 1991 economic reforms initiated by the government focusing on three important areas. One is liberalizing the industrial policy, that means the abolition of industrial licensing permit, reduction in the import tariff, etc. The next one is beginning of privatization, deregulation of markets, banking reforms, etc. Then globalization, exchange rate correction, liberalizing foreign direct investments and trade policies, removal of mandatory convertibility costs, etc. So, what exactly happened under the name of liberalization, privatization and globalization? LPG is a very famous acronym that is developed during this period, which is normally considered as a new economic policy. So, what happened, what initiatives were taken under the LPG? The salient features of the LPG are abolition of industrial licensing and permit. Previously, industrial licensing and permit was a very cumbersome procedure. More than 160 permissions have to be sought from the government for starting an industry. So, that was totally abolished, and later it was reduced to 60 or 70. Then public sector role is diluted. That means public sector enterprises which were created in a large measure, and all these were basically so slowly diluted. Then monopoly restrictive trade practices, MRTP Act limit goes, and beginning of the privatization, then free entry of foreign investment and technology, then industrial location policy liberalized, because previously industries can be located only in certain sectors, certain places and so on. That was liberalized. Then abolition of phased manufacturing programmed for new projects, then removal of mandatory convertibility costs, which means basically when the exchange is taking place, then the conversion of the total business would be converted into rupee terms, and that is was removed. Then reduction in import tariffs, deregulation of markets, then reduction of taxes. So, in nutshell, the economic reforms launched in June 1991 can be grouped into two broad areas. One, major macro economic management. Two, structural and sector specific economic reforms. Let us see one by one. One, the major macroeconomic reforms. The macroeconomic management reforms focused on controlling the politically difficult problems of reducing the fiscal and even more revenue deficits, which actually we need some kind of explanation, because the fiscal deficit means total overall income of the government, overall expenditure of the government. If you compare it, then the expenditure far exceeds the income of the government. So, that fiscal deficit, basically the elected governments always try to woo the voters, particularly the vote bank politics, which led to more announcement of freebies and all the other kinds of concessions, basically which are mainly responsible for fiscal deficit, and that is very politically very sensitive issue. So, that is the one problem basically the reforms were conducted. Then revenue deficits reflected on the excess of annual consumption expenditure by the government over its annual income. The deficits were caused by excessive employment in the government sectors, uneconomical pricing of goods and services by public sector enterprises, a growing interest burden, mounting subsidies and rising defense expenditures. These are all major heads, but these are all things which are very politically sensitive, because if you want to remove any one of them, then it will be a politically sensitive issue. Then government took initiatives to reduce the deficits by downsizing the government services personnel and also reducing the subsidies in many areas, including the agriculture sector. So, under the macroeconomic management, what exactly happened was, as a part of the macroeconomic reforms, tax reforms were initiated by the government. One is reducing the taxation for individuals and corporations, particularly they are referring to the income tax rates, and then the incidence of income tax are reduced to a greater extent, and also the corporation tax. Corporation tax means the tax imposed on corporate companies or companies which have been established by the Companies Act 1956. This tax is being imposed on the companies on the capital gains of these companies. The second one is expanding the tax base by introducing the service tax. For the first time in 1991, a new tax base was created by the government, that is called service tax. So, initially there were 3 services were included. Later currently there are about more than 300 services were under the service tax net. The next one, abolishing most export subsidies. Previously there was subsidies were given to the export companies, export industries. All these subsidies were abolished. Then increasing import duties. Then rationalizing sale tax. Sale tax is basically, it was charged differently by different states on different items. So, that was rationalized. Then rationalizing both direct and indirect taxes by removing unnecessary exemptions. So, basically because of the so many exemptions were there, it is very difficult to manage, difficult to administer. So, to make it easy, more efficient tax administration, this was done. Then next one is providing for tax incentives for infrastructure and export oriented services. Then next one, simplification of procedures in tax administration, because payment of income even for paying the income tax, even for the paying the various other taxes to the government itself became very cumbersome. That is, all these were made very easy. And resource generation through disinvestment. This is a very important thing, because many of these public sector enterprises which are running in loss, running in lead, were sold out, and then revenues generated through this disinvestment were again utilized for the various social sector development. Then when you come to the structural economic reforms, structural means basically here the structure here refers to investments in public and private sector. If you compare the investments in public and private sector prior to 1991, more investments were made on public sector rather than private sector. So, now these structural reforms trying to address the situation, and they say more investments were made on private sector, private initiatives and private participation. So, that there will be a easing of pricing, and then the various other types of benefits will be arriving at. So, reducing or changing the structure of the investments in public and private sector is normally called as a structural reforms. So, under the new economic policy, major structural reforms carried out in the following areas, particularly in trade policy. So, in trade policy, what happened? Certain trades were given incentives, so for the purpose of reducing the disparities. Then industrial policy, the new industrial policy was formulated. Under the new industrial policy, license permit Raj was totally abolished, and then there was only 2 types of industries: those industries which are directly under the control of the government, like a DRDO and so on, and other one is totally open for public, private sector. So, private sector can now start an industry in any part of the any particular area. So, there is no reserved area for the private sector or a private public sector. So, there is a new change in the industrial policy, particularly inviting the foreign direct investments in industries in India. Next one is infrastructure sector policies. That means infrastructure. Suppose, for example, in 1991 there was a new power policy was introduced formulated by the government of India, and this new power policy of 1991 entails that more participation of private sector in the power generation, power transmission and power supply. Then disinvestment and privatization policy. This is another thing is disinvestment and privatization, they all go together, because many of these public enterprises were given over to the private sector for efficient operation. Then financial sector where you find that how these financial resources were maintained, particularly in various sectors like investments, and how this savings should be utilized efficiently. So those initiatives were taken. Then policies for attracting FDI, foreign direct investments, on various projects. The main thrust was opening Indian markets to international competition, remove exchange controls, rate controls, and encourage private investment and participation in industry. And with regard to the planning, because already we have seen in the 1991 economic policy, new economic policy, it has basically it was under the regime, a planning regime. Already we are in planning regime. So the entire setup, entire system was basically formulated or being under the formulation of the planning. But now under the new economic policy, how this planning is being reoriented, how it is being restructured. So that is basically the planning in India was reoriented towards this new economic as per the objectives and intentions of the new economic policy. The policy of the government in planning as oriented towards that while private initiatives should be encouraged in most areas of business activities, the state should increasingly play a proactive role in areas in which private sector is either unwilling to act or incapable of regulating itself in social interest. So social interest is that has never been compromised by the government, even in the context of new economic policy. Then what is exactly the political economy dimensions of the reforms? Political economy means basically how, what are the sectors, which are the areas which have been benefited out of this entire new economic policy program. So one is one very important aspect where that political economy dimensions of the reforms you have to look into is that particularly taking into account the multi-diversity of India, multi-linguistic, multicultural, multi-language. So you find that almost no state in India is alike with other state. Every state has its own unique features, unique political situation, unique political orientation. All these diversities were there. So despite all these diversities, how to coordinate, how to integrate, how to get consensus among these different sets of people, this is basically the problem, basic problem we find in India. And so also with regard to the implementation of new economic policy. So that is why taking into account all this multi-diversity of India, as noted by the planning commission's members, the gradualist approach had to be adopted in pursuing the economic policy, because we cannot pursue the economic policy vigorously as in many countries have done. We have to pursue the economic policy in a very, very gradual measure, so that the repercussions and then the side effects and then after effects will be more positive. So at the state level, despite different political parties were in power in many states, suppose in southern states and other northeastern states, north states, or in the extreme western northwest states, you find there are different political parties were in power in the state, particularly for the state regime. All these political parties, even though they are different in their ideological orientation, they all implemented economic reforms in the states. So the government of India introduced a scheme called, the States Fiscal Reforms Facility from 2000 to 2005, a 5-year incentive fund for the states to implement the reforms. So this is another very important encouraging way that the central government or union government is trying to encourage the states to follow this economic reforms vigorously. Then state level initiatives. What are the state level initiatives? I am just pointing out very few and very highlighted only very few points, because there are a lot of different viewpoints, particularly how this new economic policy is being viewed by the many states. But actually most of the states on an average or on the whole, they all accepted the intentions of the new economic policy, because they have understood this is a crisis. Indian economy is in crisis. So they all agreed to cooperate, and then they tried to go in the direction given by the union government. So, at the state level initiatives, you find some of the state level initiatives where measures to improve quality of life through improving services like public health, primary education, etc. Because on the one side we are talking about market economy and so on and so forth. At the same time, the public health, investments in public health, in the primary education, in the women's education, in the downtrodden, in the education of the tribals, all these were basically considered as an investment. So, now previously it was considered as a charity, but now under the new economic regime, it is a new economic policy. All these investments, many states they made it as a investment, a social investment. Then clustering high-tech industry and services. Suppose all the high-tech industries which are capable of developing in some states, in some of the southern states and other some of the states, they cluster all these industries so that it can be a focused, more oriented towards export and also bringing about revenues to the government. Then setting up special economic zones, like for example, already the new economic policy opened up the Indian economy for foreign direct investments and other investments from foreign country. So, for facilitating this process, many states they declared many areas as a special economic zones, and agro-economic zone also being declared, basically for the purpose of making agriculture, protecting the agriculture sector. Then formulating state level industrial policy to attract investments, that is also being done. Many states in India, they have developed their own, formulated their own industrial policy to attract the investments from the various countries. Then power sector reform, that is a very, very wonderful thing, because previously power sector was concentrated on the electricity boards. Now it is being divided into three corporates, three companies: power supplies company, power generation company, and then power transmission companies. So, this is a very good initiative taken by the government and also by the states. Now, we come to the impact of the new economic policy. The impact of the new economic policy, I am taking a very, very general, and there are many positive aspects are already being understood today, and many world forums and world institutions have appreciated India for their very difficult times they have undertaken, difficult decisions they have undertaken in 1990s. So, now I am just mentioning only few points of the impact of the new economic policy in Indian economy. One is first and foremost is India was able to overcome a worst economic crisis in the shortest period of 2 years. That is very important, because we are in the crisis of that our foreign exchange reserves were capable of serving our foreign exchange deal only for 2 weeks. But now within 2 years that Indian foreign exchange reserves were increased to a greatest extent. For example, foreign exchange reserves had risen to the more than adequate level of $15.7 billion US. The current deficit was almost eliminated. That means the current deficit means the export and import of the calculation. You find there is no deficit on the part of the India. Then macroeconomic stability has endured in 10 years of economic reforms of 2003. So, from 1991 onwards, you find exactly by June 1991 the reforms started, and then till 2003 all those macroeconomic stabilization have taken place, basically because of the initial period, that is from 1991 to 2000. That period India has taken a very strong, very bold step, and also very difficult circumstances they are able to overcome. So, the macroeconomic stability has endured in the 10 years of economic reforms to 2003. That means the foreign exchange reserves reached, this is one of the very important indicators. The foreign exchange reserves reached US 70 billion in March 2003, increased to US 80 billion in the June 2003. It is a very tremendous achievement on the part of India. And India was able to integrate with the global economy, and India's share in world trade increased from 13.1% of GDP in 1990 to 20.3% of GDP in 2000. So, the economic reforms made rapid strides in select industries, and particularly in telecommunication, in software, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, research and development, professional services and scientists, technologists, doctors, nurses, teachers, management professionals, etc. No, we are the one of the top leading export. I mean, we are the people who are contributing to the technologists, particularly like doctors, nurses, teachers, management. You go to any part of the world today, you find Indians are there. So now another thing is that the areas of concern, it was not able to, particularly even though we have achieved a tremendous development. Recently, even last month, there was a very good prize in the international organizations like IMF, all these people, United Nations, they all praised India for their achievement. But still there are certain very areas of concern. One is we are not able to consolidate, we are not able to consolidate our fiscal deficits. Because the fiscal deficits, because once you started, the governments started doing their work and they need funds. The funds are being mobilized through borrowings, and these borrowings has increased. And every state, particularly even the union government, has a lot of deficits, and these deficits are managed with borrowings, and these borrowings has increased abnormally, and this is basically the major concern, how to manage this. Then India's record of social expenditure has been poor, particularly in the social sector, particularly in various social investments. We have certain doubts. Only certain states, they have done well in the social sector, but in many of the states they are not able to do it, basically because of their own problems they have, how to manage this. The next one is very important development, which is many states are not very serious in pursuing it, is that even though the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003 was enacted by the Indian Parliament, many of the states are not really following this principles and intentions of this act, because this act trying to entail means emphasize the states to take care of their fiscal discipline. Don't go for the extravagant expenditure, don't go for this unnecessary expenditures, and avoid all these unnecessary expenditures. All this they have done, and many states are not able to do it, basically because of various uncertain circumstances. Then the another very important point you have to understand is there was a jobless growth from 1990s. Jobless. New jobs were not created because despite all these promises made by many of the governments, they are not able to do it. It is not basically it is not that political parties to be blamed alone, because it has to be come from, because the economy is not just one political party's idea. It is basically it is a work of almost 141 crore people. So that is where basically we have to we face this crisis. It's a crisis. There was a jobless growth from 1990s. Then rural employment rate has increased from 7.2% in 1999. Then it was in 2000, I mean in 1999-2000, the unemployment, because rural unemployment rate will shoot up, particularly the rural out-migration. Rural out-migration may result in the urbanization crisis. Once the urbanization crisis comes, the rural unemployment will be transferred to the urban unemployment, and so also to the other effects. The next one, growing disparities between rich and poor. So there is not this development, particularly the outcome of the development of the new economic policy benefited all of them, but somehow they are able to certain set of people, section of people, they are benefited mostly. But most of the people, even though they are benefited, but the gap between rich and poor has increased abnormally. So to conclude this topic, because it is a very wider topic, but I want to just give some idea, and so that you can have some idea, because there is a lot of viewpoints, but I didn't give any viewpoints at all. It is basically the fact that is available with the documents. So, in concluding this topic, what we can say is the new economic policy adopted by the Government of India in the year 1991 is a milestone in the history of economic development in India. It will be there even for 1000 years, it will be there. Then the new economic reforms has many components including liberalization, privatization, globalization. The role of public sector enterprises and the private sector have been modified, and a greater role for the private sector is described as a structural adjustment program. And the new economic policy reoriented the direction of the economy in India. Suppose now our leaders, our policymakers, our people at different levels of sections of society, now they have different kind of orientation. We are no more totally illusionized by the various kind of ideologies. We are very clear what we want, where we are. So, in that the role of the new economic policy is very important. Then there are many positive outcomes such as growth rate, developments in select sectors like software, technology, etc. But the growth of exports and increasing role of India in global economy has been registered. With this concluding remarks, I close this lecture. Thank you.